Dennis Scholl is a filmmaker, winemaker, collector, entrepreneur, and artist advocate. In this episode, we talk about him being an obsessive guy, going country and sacred Aboriginal lands, the mistake of not valuing artists, how it feels to live with art placed by other people, and why opening the aperture is key to a meaningful and joyful life. Dennis, last night I watched your Clifford Still film, and I know that you spent 5 years working on it. He is an incredible character, and I loved hearing Neil Benezra's story because it's actually super similar to mine as I grew up in the Bay Area. And the first artist I remember falling in love with on my own, not because it was something that my grandmother collected or that I had been exposed to, but because I truly loved the work, was Clifford Still. Tell me about how you fell in love with Clifford Still and why you wanted to make that film and why it took so long.
He has always been the artist I've looked to when I was trying to understand why people make art, what they're trying to do when they make art. And subsequently, I began to make documentary films, and I have directed and produced a lot of documentary films all about art and artists. I've made short films with the Astor Gates, with Tracy Emin. I've made films in music with Wynton Marsalis and Cecile McLaurin-Salvon, who's just won the last 3 Grammys for jazz vocals. I've made 15 shorts with the Anderson Ranch in Aspen with some of the greatest artists of our time, Wangechi Mutu, Ai Weiwei, Trevor Paglen, people like that. And you don't always get to make a film about the thing that you want to make the most. It doesn't really work that way because there's issues of access and opportunity and funding and things like that. But a friend of ours, yours and mine, Dean Sobel, who preceded you at the Aspen Art Museum, wound up taking over the construction of and the completion of the Clifford Still Museum. And I didn't ask him right away because I wanted to get a few more films under my belt. But eventually I went to him and I said, I'm making documentary films and I would really love to make a film about Clifford Still. It hasn't been done in a way that looks at him from a psychological profile, et cetera. And Dean was like, what do you mean you're making films? Like he didn't really know that I was a filmmaker. And so I sent him some of my films and he says, oh my, you kind of are a filmmaker. And so luckily that relationship that I had with him in Aspen turned into the opportunity to make Lifeline, which is the story of Clifford Still and his estate, really. So it was a dream come true for me in the sense that I got to make a film about the most important artist in my life.
Which are your favorite Clifford Still paintings?
So there's one called Big Blue, which is ginormous, and it plays a kind of a significant role in the film. It's an abstract painting with a big, craggy shot of white coming down about 1/3 in from the left. It's one of the biggest paintings I think he's made. And it's the painting that when it's up and I go there, I just sit on the bench and look at. And I don't know why, and I don't know how, and I don't know what. I'm not a trained art historian. It just works for me. There's another painting that really knocked me out, and I didn't ever expect his early paintings to do much for me. They're kind of figurative, they kind of morph from going from figurative to pure abstraction. But there's one in which there are 2 people leaning down and they are shucking wheat and their hands are down to the ground. And he's got red running up and down their arms and still talks about the fact that he was basically just a hired hand to his father, somebody who worked cheap or worked for nothing at all and was worked hard. And he said he still remembers shucking the wheat and the blood running down his arms from actually gathering the wheat. So that one really sticks with me. And then the third one, I would say, and let me say differently. And then there's one painting that I actually did an hour talk on at the Clifford Still Museum, and it was Clifford Still's final work. He was about to pass. It was 1980, I believe. And throughout the film, we talk about verticality means life and horizontal means death. You can either stand up and live or lay down and die, Still said. And as he's doing this set of drawings, these little construction paper pastel drawings, the lifeline, the up and down of his life, suddenly at the end, the last drawing goes flat and it fritters across the page horizontally. And then he dies a few days later. So for me, that was like scary and dynamic at the same time, and just how powerful art can be.
I love instances where art and life fuse together, and that's an incredible example of it. I'll tell you a quick Clifford Still story. When I was interviewing for the Berkeley Art Museum, my first interview in the morning was a breakfast with a guy by the name of John Branston, who was the head of the acquisition committee at the Berkeley Art Museum at the time. And I may have referenced him in an earlier podcast because he lived with a small Rothko next to his bed. And it was incredible. And so one of the questions that he asked me was if I had an unlimited budget for myself and also for the museum, but for myself, what are the first three things that I would buy? And I said, well, the very first thing that I would buy would be a beautiful major Clifford Still painting. And I said, but one of those gorgeous blue ones, you know, with that lusciousness and that sensuality. And I said, not one of those dark black ones from the end of his life. You probably know where this story is going. Okay. My second interview that day was with two members of the curatorial staff for a walkthrough around the museum. And we go into the collection galleries and I turn the corner and there is the biggest, blackest, darkest Clifford Still painting hanging there with such pride as one of the keystones of the Berkeley Art Museum collection. And my heart sank. And I learned—
But you still got the gig.
I did still get the gig, but I realized you got to go the day before your interview and look around. So
one of the great moments, and unfortunately I didn't get it on camera, but I wanted to contemporize the film. And so I spoke to a lot of contemporary artists and people in the contemporary art world. And I got somebody to interview Mark Bradford for me. And off camera, he said, I love Clifford Still. You know why? He wasn't afraid of black. So it was a great moment. Unfortunately, you didn't get it on camera, so it doesn't count. But still embraced black. And black was his color. It was the one that in a way, when you stood in front of those paintings and you felt like they were boundaryless and they were bigger than life, it was because of the void that you were stepping into. So I think black is a critical color for him and makes all the difference in the work.
There's that great quote in your film where he talks about, and his daughter said she is quoting her father. This wasn't her own opinion, but that the Museum of Modern Art wasn't courageous enough to buy that big black painting.
Yeah. And that painting now sits with James Rondo at the Art Institute in Chicago. And it's an amazing painting. They sent me a beautiful photograph of it to use in the film. That, and when you think about the lifeline that he talks about so much, and the story of how some people believe the lifeline came about, that kind of vertical, wandering figure going down his paintings, which is reflected in so many of them, so many. It was when his father tied his ankles together and lowered him down a well, down into the well to see if they had struck water yet. Some people said there were dynamite down there. They didn't, it's a really scary story. And then he gets drawn back up the lifeline into life again. Henry Hopkins talks about that in the film. Couldn't believe it when we found that amazing clip of Henry Hopkins in San Francisco talking about Still and the lifeline. There's a lot of metaphorical things that come out of it. We're lucky because there's such a big archive.
I had never heard about that vertical line as the lifeline, but that really was insightful for me for this work. And you are a collector, and I'd love to talk with you about your collection. One of the things that struck me about the life reference to those vertical lines was some Aboriginal art, and you have a collection of Aboriginal art. And I wondered if that was something that you had thought of as well, or if that makes sense to you.
It makes sense in the context of the Aboriginal dreaming, which is kind of their cosmology, if you will. It's their creation story. And I think for Still, the lifeline is his creation story. There are many, many stories in Aboriginal art about the Seven Sisters and the creation of the land and where the mountains come from and things like that. And these kind of baseline Adam and Eve style, stories, if you're thinking in terms of Christianity, they become so important. And for Still, certainly that is what the lifeline was for him. The interesting thing about Still with regard to that is he denied all relationships from the painting to his life. If you said, wow, I can see growing up in the prairie of Alberta or growing up in North Dakota, I can see how that impacted your work, he would absolutely correct you and say, my work has nothing to do with landscape. So he wouldn't allow, if you will, and Sandra, his daughter, who's in the film, she channels him really, but she was the same way. He wouldn't allow you to draw these connections between how he lived and how he painted. He wouldn't do it. Now, the great part about that is, of course, Jerry Saltz is in the film, the Pulitzer Prize winning art critic, and he's hysterical in the film, but he says, hey, Clifford, you don't get to determine the meaning of your work. The public gets to do it. I get to do it. They get to do it. And of course, there's a lot of talk about him and landscape.
What drew you to Aboriginal art?
I was looking for a way to collect, but also a way to check out of the current contemporary art world at the time. I had felt like it had become a moment of personality and money and very little to do with the art world that I love and have embraced for over 40 years. But I can't not collect. It's just not possible for me. And I was in Australia because I've been making wine in Australia. This year will be my 20th vintage. And somebody, actually a very well-known curator down there, Rachel Kent, who is the chief curator at the ICA in Sydney, said, are you looking at our Aboriginal art? It's the best thing we have. And I said, I've seen some of it. It wasn't very good. And I've been looking at tourist art. And of course, it's really tricky when you don't know a field to separate the wheat from the chaff. And so she sent me to the New South Wales Gallery, which is kind of their metropolitan in Sydney. And you go down into the basement because unfortunately the basement is where they keep the Aboriginal art. And you look at it, I turned the corner, there it was, and it blew my mind immediately. And I was like, oh, this is the good stuff. Oh my gosh. And I got on the plane that night because I had gone down there to make the wine. I flew back home, walked in that apartment to see my wife, Deborah. And I said, you're not going to believe what we're going to do next. I mean, it was literally like a light switch. I desperately wanted to collect something. I needed a break from the contemporary art world that you've been a huge part of for decades, that I've been a huge part of for decades. It just wasn't there for me for the first time in many, many years. And this worked for me. The work happened to be very underappreciated at that time. It's starting to become more appreciated. I like to think we've had a little bit to do with that. And I'm not afraid to have the courage of my convictions. If I find something that I think is really special, I might be wrong, but that won't stop me. And we wound up amassing a collection of about 400 of these works in about 8 years. I would just, I would buy something every week, whether I needed it or not. That's always how I've collected. I bought over 2,000 works of art in my life, more than a lot of museums. And it really just felt good to me. And I began to develop a theory about what we were going to do. We put the work on the road. We had 3 separate museum quality shows, go to 16 different museum venues, 3 catalogs, 39 scholarly essays. I'm an obsessive guy, and I used that opportunity to be obsessive. And so it was great fun. I loved doing it. At the end of it, we gave the collection away. We gave it to the Metropolitan Museum in New York. the Frost Museum in Miami, which is where my alma mater is, so I could go visit it, and the Nevada Museum of Art, because they were the ones that really stood by me when I wanted to do all these museum shows, and they were the host museum for all 16 exhibitions. It was an amazing, fun project, a joyful project. I got to go to the Bush numerous times. You know, it's a privilege to be in an artist studio and watch them work, no matter where you are. And I've sat for hours and hours watching Aboriginal women in the desert, Aboriginal women in the bush up in a place called Arnhem Land, where nobody from Australia hardly ever goes. It's been a real joy.
I was just going to ask you to tell a story about an interaction with an artist, an Aboriginal artist, that was something you can't forget.
So I found who I thought and still believe to be the greatest artist in Australia living right now. His name is Warlimpurnga Japaljari. And I fell in love with his work. He's an extraordinary painter. He was in the what's the one, Heidi, in Germany every 5 years?
Documenta.
Yeah. Warlimpurnga was in Documenta. I mean, he's a really special painter. And I saw his work. I acquired a lot of it. I spoke to our mutual friend, Jeannie Greenberg, and I said, you really ought to give this one a shot, because Jeannie is so smart and open to new ideas. And so we wound up bringing him over from Australia to New York. First time he'd ever flown over water. First time he'd ever been in an elevator. First time he'd ever been on an escalator. And I said to him, I said, you know, I've shown you my world. Now you're going to show me yours. I said, I want you to take me hunting out there to hunt for goanna and this and that. And after all I had done for him, he just looked at me and said, you would die. So, you know, it was just, there's just no, it's hard to explain to people that haven't been there how different the life is. I mean, he was one of the last people to come out of the desert in 1985. Had never seen a white person, never seen a car, none of these things. Him and his family came out. They're called the Pintupi Nine. And in 1984 or 85, they were the last people out of the desert. So, you know, what an extraordinary journey. Just so much fun for me.
You talked about how Clifford Still would deny any relationship between his life and his work. What about this artist? What would he say?
Everything in his work is about his life. Everything he does is about ceremony, they call it. Everything is about going country. You know, they don't say I'm going out to my country. They just go going country. And that's what it means. They live on sacred land to them than they have for 50,000 years of art making. The relationship between art and personal behavior, art and land, is extraordinary there. The most revered people in their communities are artists. Now, how about if we started doing that here? How about if the Western society revered artists in the way that the Aboriginal community does? It's really, really interesting how art making to them, it isn't in any way frivolous. It isn't an accoutrement. It isn't the other. It is central thesis of their life for many, many of these communities. There's a community way out in Western Australia. I go there by bush plane sometimes. And of the 300 people that live there, 70 of them are talented, successful, revenue-earning painters. You don't see that very often, where a quarter of the community are kick-ass painters.
I have said many times, and I'm going to say it until I can't breathe anymore, that I think art is a basic human right. And I am tirelessly going to continue to work to have people agree with that or fight me about it. It would be amazing if in the United States of America, we would privilege artists in that same way that you're talking about. You are also making some of these efforts. You did when you ran the Knight Foundation. You're doing it now at Oolittle. Talk about why you do that.
Well, I think that I revere artists, and I think that once again, much like when I said I'm going to collect Aboriginal art because people aren't, I think that in our society is making a mistake. Our society isn't valuing artists for what they bring. Think about where we are right now in this quarantine time. Think about the moment that we're in. What are people using to get themselves through this time? They're using art every single day. They're not using industry, they're not using commerce, they're using art. Whether they're binging on Netflix or taking an online drawing class or listening to music, everybody that I know of, everybody in our society, everybody in the world right now is using art and culture to get themselves through this time. If that doesn't create value, if that's not a basic human right, I don't know what to say. So at Oolite Arts, we have started it for our little community because we basically support the artists of Miami-Dade County. And we've started a relief fund for artists. We put a little bit of money into it, but the community came out of the woodwork for us. And we've raised over $120,000 just for the artists of Miami-Dade County. And the money continues to pour. I did an op-ed piece in yesterday's Miami Herald about artists, and what it means to our community and how our community has become an internationally recognized city, primarily on the backs of artists because of culture. And the response I got was unbelievable. I stuck it up on my Instagram, and of 1,150 posts, it's the second most responded to post that I've ever put up. So people know, people care, people believe in what you're saying. But this has been a really great moment of reflection to remind ourselves about that, which I think is maybe one of the nice things that will come out of this, is that we will begin to value culture in a way that reflects how we used it during this difficult time period.
Well, I always admire people who do things rather than just say them. And this is a moment where I think character is becoming clear. Your self-reflexive comment about your obsessive nature is, I think, super accurate. And it's one of the things I've always loved about you is you say what you think and you do what you say you're going to do. How do you get obsessed with things? What does it feel like when something captures your attention?
I've thought about that a lot as I've gotten older. And it's the kind of thing that you wish you could know was coming, figure out, sort out for yourself, but it isn't that kind of thing. It's more of a thing where when I know I've got bandwidth to do something new, the one thing I do, and I try to do very well, is I try to open the aperture. I try to let more things come in to me than I normally do. I find myself thinking about a broader range of things. I'm in the middle now of thinking about the next film I'm going to begin to work on. I'm in the middle of a couple of films. And I'm doing that right now. I'm opening the aperture saying, well, what is it that you think would be fun or interesting? And it doesn't come to you head on. It kind of comes in the side door sometimes. You'll get a random remark somebody will make when you're talking with them. You can't bottle it. You can't order it up. It's not like takeout or pickup like we're doing right now. You simply have to keep your mind open to the possibilities. I mean, who would have ever thought that a hardcore contemporary art nerd like me would come back and drop the contemporary art world for literally 8 years, and only 95% of my time, I guess, was spent collecting Aboriginal contemporary art and bringing it to the world. You just got to leave yourself open until you find something that meets your parameters. It helps to have a good screen. You've got to have a good screen. You have to believe in your instincts. And that to me is really, really important. I've done it in business too. I've made some decisions in business that were early. Some people thought that have worked out. And for me, there's no difference between doing an Aboriginal art project that costs me millions of dollars and doing a business situation that makes me millions of dollars. It's still just a project. Life is a journey through a series of projects for me. And that's why I just try to keep the aperture open. That would be what I would say to people.
It's a great metaphor or illustrative description. So, are there strategies to open the aperture?
Yeah, I mean, I think you have to. Uh, I think in order to stay open like that, reading helps. I think walking quietly with yourself helps. I've done a lot of walking this year. I put a Fitbit on and said I was going to get a lot of steps. I'm almost to 5 million. I got 10 days to go for my year of Fitbitting. But the walking, I think, has been very helpful. The other thing that's been helpful to me, which is very odd, is actually capturing the stuff. Something pops into your head, a little nibble of something. You got to take your phone out and put it in your notes right away, because that stuff goes away as quick as it comes in. So I think capturing those thoughts and going back and looking at them, 90% of the ones you write down are going to be junk, but you only need 1 or 2 good ideas a year to keep you going. And people forget that sometimes too. You know, you're going to reject an awful lot of things. That's okay. You don't need 53 good ideas. You need 1 good idea. It's the same thing, Heidi, I would guess, when you're choosing shows. You know, everybody in the world wants a show curated by you, but you're the person who has to decide, just like the next film I'm going to make, you have to decide, well, who am I going to invest the level of energy over the next 2 years that I have to invest? What artist is it that's going to hold my attention, that's right for me? Because not all the best artists are necessarily right for the best curators. So I would push that question back at you and say, how do you make that decision when you're thinking about picking an artist? What gets you over the hump?
I love the idea of the fact that you really only need 1 or 2 good ideas. I had a really early experience with Doug Aiken, who's one of my closest friends. And we used to have dinner together 5 nights a week in New York. And as I was getting ready to curate my first show ever, I was steeling myself to bring it up in one of our regular dinner conversations to ask his opinion of the idea. So we're at dinner, and, I could feel myself sort of like, pinching my hands to make myself courageous. And I told him the idea for the show, and he goes, yeah, okay, that's interesting. What else do you have? I was like, what? I need more than what? And it was such a great formative moment for me, because it is about that sort of simultaneous spitballing, like thinking about all the different things you could do, and then what sits and what has that resonance. And I have a slightly different strategy than you. I don't write things down as they first come to me, because I feel like my filter is that they have to come back a couple of times. So I see them, I acknowledge them, and then I let them go. And if they come back and I can't get it out of my head, even if I don't like it, oftentimes I know what I should do because it really bugs me. And I either can't understand it, or I find it annoying, or it makes me almost physically uncomfortable. I can almost feel it under my skin. And that's how I know that it will be sustaining for me to invest the time and energy to work on that. And one of the people that you interview in the Clifford Still film is Julian Schnabel. And he's the perfect example of that for me. I knew the work sort of when I was in college, never thought that much about it. Saw a show of purple paintings at Gagosian Gallery and thought, this stuff looks so fresh. It was at least, a decade and a half, maybe 2.5 old. And I circled around to it, sat with that for a while, did a studio visit. That work wasn't enough for me. Then I started to think what else I could do. Then I was looking at the plate paintings, and I thought they were just not attractive. They were just not something I would want to spend time looking at. And so then I just kept coming back to it. And I knew that's what I had to do.
You built your career on doing that, but also being right. And there's a difference between doing it and being right. For me, my filmmaking has been about making films. My filmmaking has been about making films about people who either had a moment and then lost it, or are about to have a moment and getting there kind of just in time. So when I do get these inputs that we're talking about, I ask myself, is this a story, not that I want to tell just, but that I'm the right person to tell? That's why some of the difficult things that are going on right now about who gets to tell whose story, that's been difficult for me because I've made a number of films about different cultures. And that isn't the most popular thing to allow to have happen right now. And I understand that, but it has been a little restrictive. But for me, it's that integration of, wow, that's an interesting idea, and gee, I might be the right guy to tell that story, because I tell these stories about people that had a moment and have been forgotten. I did a story about Clifford Still in the 50s who was forgotten. I did a story about soul music in Miami in the 60s. Those guys were forgotten. A ballerina that came from Cuba in the 80s who was forgotten. So you do build up a context within your own personal curation, and I use that word more liberally than you might, but you do build up a context of what's right for you, where you can bring it to a very high level based on what you've done already. And you and I both have philosophies about that and ways of working that have, been really strongly recognized.
One of the ways that you and I have collaborated is you and Deborah invited me to go through your collection and install it in your home. And I was the 17th or 18th person to do that. And it is basically without restriction. And then you guys live with the art that's selected and where it's placed. And I even got to move some of the furniture around so that I could have the work stand out in a different way. Explain to me what it feels like to see the work that you chose maybe in different ways because of inviting other people to select and place and filter.
Yeah, in theory, it feels great. In practice, it drives me crazy, but that's why I do it. Because it's hard. It's hard. I mean, it's not like we're inviting people to bring their art to our house and hang it. Right. Everything that you get to choose from are things that we've chosen on an individual basis. So it is our art collection. But as you know, we have a lot of stuff. Even after making gifts of 500 or 600 works over the last 6 or 7 years, giving work away like crazy, we're still well over 1,000 works. And so when we started it, it was great because we were pretty good at picking the art and acquiring it. And we were terrible at hanging it, installing it, creating stories, putting things next to each other and have them say something. We were bad at it. I mean, I'm not going to lie. I would get something new and I would put it above the fireplace. And one day, a dealer we both know well named Casey Kaplan came to the house and he said, "Oh, I see you're a trophy hanger." And oh, that made me mad. And a few months later, a very well-known curator, Douglas Fogel, came to the house. And I said, "I've got all this stuff." I said, "Do you want to try to do something with it?" And he goes, "What do you mean?" I said, "Well, if you could hang anything you wanted, what would you do?" And he says, "Oh, I do this, this, this." I said, "Good." I said, "Come back in a few weeks and do it." And so Douglas Fogel was the very first curator to hang the collection. He actually took a very large Thomas Demand a photograph. Thomas made very, very big photographs. And this was one of Jackson Pollock's barn. They were tableaus that he created and then photographed. And he took it and he sat it in front of the fireplace at the end of the hanging. And I came home and I said, "Oh, I'm so disappointed you didn't install that." He goes, "No, we're going to install it." I said, "Where?" He says, "Right there." I said, "Douglas, there's a fireplace there." He said, "Take it out. This is Florida. You don't need a fireplace." And in the way that he challenged us, we said, "You know what? We're going to take it out." It gives us a great big new wall in the living room. So we removed our fireplace and boarded it up so that Douglas would have the ability to put something there. And that kind of set the stage for us to give up control, which I don't do very well at all. But it set the stage for us to give up control. So when the curators come, we get out of their way. We say, do what you want to do. You want to rearrange the furniture, rearrange the furniture. It has become so much more rewarding for us than it is any hassle. It is so much, we learn so much about art that we've forgotten about. We learn so much about, because when you have that much stuff and you don't see but 5% of it at a time, it's kind of sad in a way. And so when collectors come to the house and say, oh, this, I know this, and this, it's joyful because people come every year. We have obviously Art Basel down here across the street from where we live. And so we get, 1,000 people come through the house every year, mostly museum groups. We've had every museum group practically in the world come through, and it's joyful. It's joyful. And watching the curators do their thing and talking to them about the juxtapositions that they're creating, man, I've become a lot smarter as a collector and as a curator of my own things by watching people like you and Connie Butler and Jessica Morgan and Matthew Higgs and Jeremy Deller did it together one year. That was a trip because they're both also artists. I think they hung like 12 works in the whole house because everything deserves its own space. But to have the cool thing is it caught on and it became kind of a cause celeb thing to do for up and coming curators. So we've been able to get just about anybody we wanted, and we have taken advantage of that. Very joyful. It's probably the thing we're most known for in the art world is giving our house to somebody and giving them the keys to the storage and saying, do your thing.
I loved doing it. It was super fun. And part of what was joyful for me about doing it was the excitement that you and Deborah had when you looked at my list, when you came back into the house after I was working with the installers to hang things. And there was a glee, there was a curiosity. And I think that is one of the biggest opportunities around art. I think some of the things art can do for us is to give us courage, surprise us, give us joy and surprise and delight. And I really experienced that in, you're showing me a Peter Halley. Who put that there?
Joanne Northrup.
Awesome. Yeah. Oh, by the de Kooning. Nice. Okay.
And then there's a Tuttle.
Beautiful.
Tuttle de
So
Kooning Halley. You don't see that every day.
No, definitely not. Definitely not. You referenced earlier about having been in Australia because you were there making wine. And I had Richard Betts also on my podcast. And I was doing a virtual wine tasting the other day with some friends of mine. And a friend of mine brought out Richard's scratch and sniff book. And, he thanks you. And I love how interconnected we all are. I was telling the story about Mark Grosjean's work being on one of the first bottles. Tell the story, if you would, about how you started making those wines and asking artists to do those images for the bottles, for the labels.
It goes back to this opening of the aperture thing that we were talking about. And also, what have you done in your life that you turned out to be good at? And so Richard and I became friends. I drank a lot of wine at the Little Nell, frankly. That's a good way to become somebody's friend. And he had been offered a bunch of different opportunities, and they weren't right for him. He was young. He hadn't had a lot of experience yet. The people that were trying to get him to do things were just going to give him the money and walk away, and he was going to really have a tough time. And I said to him, you can't do these things because you're only going to get one bite at the apple. If you screw it up, they're not going to come back. So he said, yeah, but this is what's being offered to me. I said, Richard, what is it that you want to do? He said, if I had my choice, and then it goes back to like picking who you're going to curate, or for me, picking what's next in a film. He said, if I had my choice, I would make Grenache in Australia. And I was like, okay. Nobody was drinking Grenache from Australia. Nobody was interested in Grenache from Australia. They would basically throw it into the vat with everything else when they were making these red blends. And I said to him, Richard, why don't we do it in California? There's Grenache in California. He says, come to dinner tonight. So I go to dinner that night. He's got 10 bottles lined up on the counter. They're all in bags. You can't tell what's what. He said, taste. Order them from best to worst. All right. Drink. We drink some wine. I order them best to worst. He goes, now watch. He takes out the best bottle. It's Australian. Second best Australian. Third best Australian. Fourth best Australian. And he says, that's why we're not going to make Grenache in California. I was like, okay, I think we're going to get a lot of frequent flyer miles. So I offered to do this project with him as a lark. And it was just going to be a little bit of wine. And if it didn't work out, we drink it ourselves. It would have been fine. Well, we hit something. We nailed something. First of all, we nailed it in terms of making Grenache in Australia safe for Americans to drink. And then Richard loves hip hop. I love hip hop. I love contemporary art. Richard was learning a lot about contemporary art. I said, why don't we ask my friends to do the labels? And he said, great. And so the first one was Anna Gaskell, who, is really the first artist I ever collected in depth and just fell head over heels for. And that's how that happened. She had done a drawing for my birthday of a woman who was head over heels. We now recast as being head over heels for our Grenache, of course. And then we asked people like Jim Lambie and Isaac Julian. We asked Raymond Pettibone. As soon as Raymond did it, everybody wanted to do it because Raymond's like the coolest guy in the world. Everybody, loves Raymond. And we actually wound up having Mark Rochon do it, which was really incredible. I'm trying to think of Liam Gillick, and there might be one or two others. But we took things we cared about and, again, melded them with things that we were trying to do. We took ideas that we had that we cared about deeply and put them together. And it became a really big thing. We sold the company in 7 or 8 years to a public company. And it worked out pretty happily for both of us. Nobody makes money making wine, but we happened to. We just got very fortunate, and it blew up. And we did a good job, I think, in making people care about our wine. Who knew that the guys that run bottle shops like the Grog Shop and Grape and Grain are all hip hop heads? So when we started naming the wines, the OG and the Chronic, those guys went for the wine like crazy. We couldn't make enough wine at that point. So, take things you love and put them together and stir, over a low simmer and see what happens. That's really how that works out.
This seems like the recipe for a great life.
Well, I'm lucky because I've had a partner now for 42 and a half years, my wife, Deborah, and we met the first day of law school. And the thing about Deborah is that people think they know me and I'm the guy who's super brave and trying crazy things all the time. Deborah is the one with the courage in the family. She's the one when I pucker up and say, I don't know if I'm ready for this, or I'm not sure that this is right for us. Deborah goes, let's just do it. So thanks to her, really, most of these things have happened. I get a lot of good ideas, but sometimes I get chicken when it comes to executing them. And Deborah makes sure that I don't chicken out. So that's a pretty great thing to have in a partner.
I think one of the opportunities that all of this time at home or the time absent of our traditional commitments is affording is the opportunity to think about what really matters, and that there are different strategies for that. And it's super personal, right? You can have something that everyone else wants and have it not be right for you and be okay walking away from it because you like to try new things, right? Or that's what courage feels like.
Yeah, I'm enjoying this time, and I know it's a difficult time for everybody, and I don't mean to minimize it, but I'm enjoying what this time is giving me, the time to step back a little bit and to say, what do I want to do with the next 5 years? I've always been kind of a person who thinks about life in 5-year chunks, and I just want to keep making films. I want to keep making wine. I want to keep collecting art. And I want to keep helping my community. That's something that I put a lot of time and energy into. And those are the things that make me happy. Those are the things that give me joy. And I'm trying to do only joyful things right now.
5-year blocks seem like reasonable blocks of time to think about. 1 year's too short, 10 years is too long, 5 seems Goldilocks style, just right.
I've never done anything for longer than 7 years, except for stay with my wife. She's the only constant. That and collecting art are the only two constants in my life. I didn't make a film until 8 or 9 years ago. I mean, I was old by then. I didn't go to film school. I just woke up one day and said, gee, I think I'm going to make a film about why African American women wear hats to church. It's a 5-minute film. It had its debut at the Aspen Shorts Fest of all places. I didn't know that was a big deal at the time. So yeah, I think that, you can plan all you want, but the world takes you where it wants. But when I do find something I enjoy doing, I do try to spend more time now as I've gotten older, fully developing it before it kind of runs out of steam or I move on to something else.
One of my favorite expressions, and I don't mean this in a religious way, but, man plans and God laughs.
That's true. Yeah, it is true. It is true. Certainly, we're feeling that right now. We had this world we thought was all figured out, and we'd never had anything like this for hundreds of years, literally. And here we are. And so, I just wish everybody well, and I hope people get back on their feet very, very quickly. Like I said, that's what I'm spending my time over the last month and the next month doing, is making sure that artists are going to survive this, because they are a very fragile population in our country. It's not like it is in Europe, where Germany's teeing up, billions of dollars for artist support. You're nobody special here in America when it comes to the government and to how people look after artists. So we're going to do our best to try to help people continue to be able to make rent, have food, things like that. It's that basic right now.
So, Dennis, why does art matter?
Well, it matters to me because it's been such a huge part of my life. We have a mutual friend, Mira Rubel, who always goes around saying, art can save a life. And everybody has their own personal philosophy about why art matters. But again, I would say, look at what people have fallen back on in these last 4 weeks. They've fallen back on art. I used to use the example of, what do you remember about the Greeks and the Romans? And of course, all you really remember about them is their culture. I'll stop using that example, and I'll be using the coronavirus quarantine example for the rest of my life. What did we look to for sustenance when we were grounded like this? We looked to culture over and over and over again. Some highbrow culture, some lowbrow culture. Doesn't matter. It's about creating for the joy and benefit of others. And we've seen a lot of that reliance in these last 4 weeks, and we're going to see a lot more of it to come.
Thanks so much for talking to me today. I always love our conversations.
What a joy, Heidi. Thank you.
Thanks. Bye. Conversations About Art is part of Heidi.art. Simon Illa is our producer. Our theme music was composed by Eric McDougall. Blake Migden helped with social media. If you like what you heard, please subscribe and review us on whichever platform you listened, as it helps us further our goal of connecting all to art. We will be back again every Tuesday with new episodes. Thanks for listening.